This is footage put out by a pro-Russian journalist and an official at the Russian Foreign Ministry over the weekend, purporting to show Russian troops lowering the Ukrainian flag and raising the Russian flag in the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka. With just 4 days until the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and less than a month until the Russian presidential election, Russia's capturing of Avdiivka, their first major military victory in months, has handed Russian President Vladimir Putin a major political win. And the Biden administration is not being coy about why they think Ukraine lost this specific battle. Here was Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, earlier today on a call with reporters from the White House.
This happened in large part because Ukraine is running out of weapons due to congressional inaction, and Ukrainian troops didn't have the supplies and ammunition they needed to stop the Russian advances.
Last week, the Senate passed a bill with $60 billion of aid to support Ukraine in this war. And passing the bill to the House, where Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, says that he will not be rushed to pass it. He didn't even bring it to the floor last week, and now Congress is on recess. So what does this delay mean for our allies in Ukraine, and what can President Biden do if Congress won't do its job and act? Joining us again is Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor for the Obama White House. So, Ben, the Biden administration tying the loss of Avdiivka very directly to the lack of U.S. aid because of congressional inaction. Is this a good strategy on the part of the White House to try to ratchet up the public pressure on GOP lawmakers holding up this aid?
Yes. And look, this is not hyperbole. You and I, sometimes arguments are made to kind of put pressure on that are about some hypothetical future. It is the case that this is now an artillery battle, a small arms battle along a very long front line. And what's happened is the Russians have ramped up their capacity to churn out that kind of weaponry for their troops at the front line. They've also backfilled a lot of their supplies from North Korea, of all places. And the Ukrainians are running short. They just don't have the kind of pipeline of supplies that they need to be in this frontline battle with a larger Russian army and a larger Russian military. And so I think it's right to both point out the stakes involved here. This is not about getting the Ukrainians some new capability, the kind of thing that we were talking about over the last year or so. Do they get F-16s or do they get this kind of tanks? This is about literally whether or not they're going to have the kind of lifeline of supplies that they need to hold out against a larger Russian military. And it is absolutely absurd that the reason that we can't even have a vote on this is because some Speaker of the House is worried about losing his job to a bunch of MAGA lunatics in his caucus, when we know that if it was put to a straight up or down vote in the House, it would pass with pretty healthy amounts of Republican support here. So I think it is worth dialing up the pressure here, because that's what the stakes are in real life, in the real world, not in the kind of MAGA world of Republican politics in Washington.
So to your point, and you certainly know Washington better than I do, is Biden's only path here to go through Mike Johnson? I mean, is there anything Biden can do to help the situation in Ukraine without needing to work with, as Liz Cheney called it, the Putin wing of the Republican Party that includes people like MAGA Mike Johnson?
Yeah, I think the only way that you get the kind of robust package that is absolutely required is to kind of work through Mike Johnson, or to find some other procedural way to force a vote in the House of Representatives. Obviously, Mike Johnson could bring that bill to the floor tomorrow if he wanted to. There are other lengthier and more problematic and challenging procedural ways to try to force a vote that, frankly, would take time and are not guaranteed to succeed. Absent that, absent passing a supplemental, there are things that the administration could do to try to move around stockpiles in Europe, try to resupply the Ukrainians that way. But let's be clear, that's not anywhere near the efficiency of just passing this bill. And anywhere near the scale of what the Ukrainians need. And so I do think after a long time of trying to work with Republicans and attach border provisions to the bill in the Senate, all of that months that have been put into trying to make this easier for the Republican Party to move this forward, I think the only way is real pressure and pointing out the real life stakes that are involved in this being held up like this.
Let me ask you really quickly about sanctions. President Biden said that the U.S. will unveil sanctions against Russia on Friday in response to the killing of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. If you were in charge of those sanctions, what would they entail? What might they look like? And would it be an appropriate response here?
I frankly just don't think that there's some additional sanction that's going to make much difference here. The Russians have learned to live and frankly evade and work around really robust sanctions. I think that a couple of things that you want to put on the table is there are several $100 billion in frozen Russian reserves. Trying to expedite ways to get that money into the hands of the Ukrainians is something I think that should be looked at. And frankly, another thing is someone who spoke with Alexei Navalny over the years, doing a bit of what he did, which is exposing the corruption and kleptocracy of the Russian regime and their cronies, kind of taking up the mantle of spotlighting the uncomfortable things that Putin didn't want spotlighted, whether it's his wealth or the wealth of his cronies or how he steals money from his people. So there are things that can be done, I think, in addition to kind of whatever sanctions are introduced. I also think there should be open-ended efforts to pursue accountability and justice for the people that killed Navalny. And I don't think that that will necessarily yield results immediately. But you want people to know in that system, in that Russian system, that so long as they're around, there are going to be efforts to hold them accountable. So there's a range of things that I think can and should be done. I don't think we should sit here and pretend like a few more sanctions are going to have a huge consequence here, though.
Yeah, but the important message is accountability, no matter how long it takes. Ben Rhodes, always a pleasure. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for your time tonight.